knowledge, enjoyment, and the speaking body. This, you've heard me say, is the holy conceptual trinity of Seminar 20. Chapters 10 and 11 of this key text in Lacanian Psychoanalysis allow us to further show how this trinity hangs together, especially when it comes to knowledge and the speaking body. To start, a bit of review. And to start this review, a saying, one Lacan's been repeating for a while now, right up to the end of Seminar 20, ourselves as well. The act and fact of saying remains forgotten behind what is said in what is heard. At stake in this saying, you'll recall, is a certain distance, as Lacan puts it, between the saying, dir, and the said, di. There's the living, embodied, corporal event of opening one's mouth, raising one's voice, and saying something like this. The fact that I'm talking to you right now, on the 8th of November, 2024, is likely to be forgotten behind what I will have said, as determined by what you will have heard and presumably understood of what I'm saying right now, whenever this lecture reaches you, in a week, in a month, in a year, or 10. What will have been said by the time you hear and presumably make sense of this saying? What indeed will have been said? I don't know, 40 to 50 words in a rather tangled sentence whose inscription may also have just appeared across your screen, racing in the form of captions. And voila, the D mention, spelled D-I-T mention, that we've been discussing, where what is said as a result of any act of saying takes center stage. And if you don't believe me, pay a visit to the Lectures on Lacan archive. Tap any of our previous series and watch how what's been said emerges from this D mention as just that, what's been said. How different, really, are the past lectures available at our archive from the previous ones recorded before, from the ones you're hearing right now? Relative to the right now in which you're hearing these remarks, which is clearly different from the right now in which I'm making them, or any other remarks available on our archive, or any other remarks that you may have heard from me before we started this whole damn escapade. Relative to the right now of saying, all of these saids take precedent. The lived, embodied, corporally contingent moments that went into the making of these saids, these sayings that preceded these saids, are no longer. They've slipped into forgetting behind what I've said in the past and what I will have said by the time this lecture finds you. Let me try and be clear with all this, because I think the stakes, conceptually speaking, but also clinically so, are rather high here at this point at the end of Seminar 20. The act of saying, in which my body is now engaged, will have passed into a dimension, and with it my speaking body as well, leaving behind only a set of spoken beings. And by spoken beings, I don't just mean saids, I also mean subjects. Sayings lost in saids, bodies lost in beings, speakers lost in subjects. This is the name of the game we call language use, and by extension, knowledge. And this, my friends, is how Seminar 20 ends. Let's see if we can back our way into this discursive tangle by recalling what we've learned about knowledge so far. What is said, here's that D spelled D-I-T again, yields two types of knowledge, I've told you, conscious and unconscious. Both are premised on a simple axiom, another saying, in fact, that appears at the start of chapter 11, the final chapter in Seminar 20. And it goes like this. Nothing is, if not insofar as it is said that it is. Page 137, Standard English Translation, check it out. Here is the said language Lacan spoke about in chapter 9, but also the said la language, Lalangue, to which he alludes in chapter 11, and to which we're going to return in just a moment, because that's a new one for us, for Lacan as well. As we learned in chapter 9, the said language corresponds to conscious knowledge in all of its inertia, which Lacan redefines as the language of being at the start of chapter 10. It's an interesting and especially revealing move, especially when you connect it to what he is doing at the end with ignorance, love, and hate. The passion for ignorance that drives love to its most tragic telos, hate. We'll come to that in a moment. For now, notice how he redefines this said language that corresponds to conscious knowledge as the language of being at the start of chapter 10. Being, he says, is merely presumed in certain words. Individual, for instance, and substance. In my view, it is but a fact of what is said. And the word for said here is, of course, D, spelled D-I-T. So let's ask, how is this said language, as a language of being, related to the said la language, of which the unconscious is comprised? Simply put, it's what we try to know about the latter. The language that props up our fantasies of conscious knowledge is an attempt to come to terms with the function of the la language that constitutes unconscious knowledge. And it's an attempt that always fails, my friends, if only because what the subject of the unconscious knows how to do with Lalangue far exceeds what any conscious subject can learn and even learn to enjoy about this know-how. And note that shift. Unconscious knowledge at the level of Lalangue comes down to know-how. The key passage for all of this is the one I'm sure you encountered. If not in this reading of Seminar 20, perhaps in another, and if not in a reading of another version of Seminar 20, perhaps you encountered it while reading some secondary scholarship. It's a terrific passage. For us, it starts at the bottom of page 138 and continues through most of 139. I read it in full so we can have it before us. If I've said that language is what the unconscious is structured like, that is because language, first of all, doesn't exist. Language is what we try to know concerning the function of la language. And you can see how Bruce renders this with a double L at the front of language, so it looks like L language. In French, you have Lalangue mostly as one word with a la at the front, so it kind of has a la swing to it, which is why you'll hear me refer to it as Lalangue in the original French or la language just to keep that la going, which is not readily apparent in the translation of Lalangue that Bruce gives us here at the bottom of 138. Anyway, Lacan continues. Certainly, it is thus that scientific discourse itself approaches language, except that it is difficult for scientific discourse to fully actualize language, since it misrecognizes the unconscious. The unconscious evinces knowledge that for the most part escapes the speaking being. That being provides the occasion to realize just how far the effects of la language go, in that it presents all sorts of affects that remain enigmatic. Those affects are what result from the presence of la language insofar as it articulates things by way of knowledge, that go much further than what the speaking being sustains by way of enunciated knowledge. Language is, no doubt, made up of la language. It is knowledge's harebrained lucubration about la language. But the unconscious is knowledge, a knowing how to do things with la language. And what we know how to do with la language goes well beyond what we can account for under the heading of language. La language affects us, first of all, by everything it brings with it by way of effects that are affects. If we can say that the unconscious is structured like a language, it is in the sense that the effects of la language, already there qua knowledge, go well beyond anything the being who speaks is capable of enunciating. It is in that regard that the unconscious, insofar as I base it on its deciphering, can only be structured like a language that is always hypothetical, and with respect to what supports it, namely Lalangue, hypothetical indeed. What then is this la language of the unconscious know-how that exceeds, and for this reason ever eludes, linguistic capture at the level of the word, at the level of the said language, at the level of the language of being that shores up all the sense-making that we know as conscious knowledge? The term la language has been popping up since chapter 4 and ever in distinction from language here without the added la. Notice, for instance, the first occurrence we encounter on page 44 of our text. Language. The language, here is long, forged by philosophical discourse, is such that, as you see, I cannot but constantly slip back into this world, into this presupposition of a substance that is permeated with the function of being. So note this. On the one side, you've got language, philosophical discourse, and the function of being. Following the thread of analytic discourse goes in the direction of nothing less than breaking up anew, inflecting, marking with its own camber, a camber that could not even be sustained as that of lines of force, that which produces the break or discontinuity. Our recourse in la language is to that which shatters it. Note the discursive additions here. The language of conscious knowledge is forged in the discourse of philosophy, and the la language of unconscious know-how is dealt with by the discourse of psychoanalysis. But also note Bruce's helpful footnote at the bottom of page 44, since we're still just trying to understand what Lacan means here by Lalangue. This footnote is pretty useful. It's number 15 at the bottom of page 44. And here's what Bruce tells us. The French here, la langue for la language, is a term Lacan creates by simply putting together the feminine article la with the noun langue, meaning language, but specifically spoken language, as in tongue. Lacan discusses what he means by Lalangue in the course of this seminar, as well as elsewhere. Very roughly speaking, it has to do with the acoustic level of language, the level at which polysemy is possible due to the existence of homonyms, like those Lacan plays on throughout this seminar. It is the level at which an infant or songwriter may endlessly repeat one syllable of a word. For example, la, la, la. The level at which language may stutter as well. So I'm keeping the la language part to emphasize this la, la, la that's suggested, the way a syllable might be repeated by an infant or perhaps a songwriter. It's pretty good stuff. It's actually quite useful to keep this footnote in mind as we start digging into Lalangue. But recall some other passages where we've encountered this term in Seminar 20. How about on page 84, with the homonyms that culminate in soul love? Notice Lacan's using Lalangue there as well. And what about the polysemy on page 106? Check it out. It's there as well. And how about that D-mention we've been discussing, as Lacan points out in chapter 10? Note, in this passage I want to share with you, where we get an illustration of Lalangue at work, Lacan is talking about knots and writing. Rings of String, chapter 10, is fabulous on knots relative to writing. And that's what he's talking about here in the passage I'm about to share with you. He's talking about knots and writing, and about how writing is effectively the flattening out of a knot. And if you don't believe me, take this sentence, the sentence you're hearing right now, and write it down in cursive, and you'll see what Lacan means. Cursive writing, in particular, does a great job of showing you how the written word, the handwritten word, consists in a series of flattened knots, visible wherever you see the lines cross. But that's not the point that I want to bring up here. It's good stuff in chapter 10, but it is not the key issue for us. We're trying to understand Lalangue, and we're looking for an illustration. And Lacan says D-mention, D-I-T mention, is a good example of this. What are we indeed to make of this flattened out series of knots that he's discussing in chapter 10? Check it out. It's on page 132. He's going to tell us exactly what we're to make of the flattened out knot. Note that the flattened out knot is something other than a surface, Lacan says. It presupposes an entirely different dimension, spelled D-I-T, than the continuity implicit in space. And that is why I use a written form of the word that designates therein the mention of what is said, D. That is permitted only by the law language that I speak, but it is not such that I need deprive myself of it inasmuch as I speak. Quite the contrary, given what I think about it, I dare say. Here's the point. On the page, in print or in cursive, the English word dimension looks different and distinct from the Lacanian coinage dimension. You see, you can read them in a way that makes them sound exactly the same, dimension and dimension. But when you write out the words, D-I-M-E-N-S-I-O-N relative to D-I-T-M-E-N-S-I-O-N, they look quite different and distinct. But again, dare to say these words aloud with me. They're homonymic as hell. Dimension sounds like dimension when you read them out loud. That's language for you. Wait, you're telling me. That's too many la's, McCormick. There's only one la on the front of this one. But I didn't stutter, did I? Of course I fucking did. That's the point. I said it exactly as you heard it. And I'm happy to do it again. Encore without the space. Language. Okay. One more quip, and then I promise I'll get serious with you all. We're at the end of things. I'm feeling light and a little breezy right now. But one more quip, I promise, and then I'll get to it. If, as Lacan says, language is no doubt made up of la language, as he claims on page 139, but la language always goes well beyond language, can't we say that some, but not all, la language finds expression in language? And if so, what exactly is this some? Maybe it's the feminine la that Lacan adds to the French langue to get la langue, namely la language. But in barred form, like the crossed out la of la femme, which allows us to say things like the woman doesn't exist. Language with a capital L, like woman with a capital W, doesn't exist. You just heard Lacan tell you language doesn't exist. It's the weirdest saying at the start of the lengthy passage we just studied, where he introduces us conceptually to Lalangue. And what he tells us is language doesn't exist, and this might be one of the reasons why. Its la, like hers, is only ever barred. Yet another reason, it seems to me, why the la-di-da-sein of the unconscious, you might say, exceeds that hair-brained lucubration known as consciousness. And don't forget what this term lucubration means. It's from the Latin lucubratio. It's the act of working by candlelight, those San Francisco nights, which in turn derives from the verb lucubrare, meaning to work indeed by night. From the vast, interminable darkness of unconscious Lalangue, the language of conscious knowledge reveals only what can be seen in the limited light provided by a candle. Harebrained indeed to speak of anything like consciousness when it's only ever by candlelight that we see. You heard me say that what is said, the D, yields two types of knowledge, and with them two kinds of said language. Conscious knowledge is a dimension of language, in which things are said and known, and thus made sense of. But unconscious knowledge is different, you'll recall. Unconscious knowledge is a dimension of la language, in which some things can be said and known, but only as nonsense, and other things cannot be said and known, and thus remain absent from the field of consciousness. Notice the logic here, which at this point I don't think I'll ever tire of recalling with you. Beyond the known, there is the knowable, and beyond the knowable, the unknowable. Nonsense beyond sense and absence beyond them both. This is what happens when you see the dialectical relation between conscious and unconscious knowledge. There's the known, of which we are conscious. There's the unknowable part of the unconscious. And then there is, in between them, the knowable part of the unconscious that can become a part of the known by way of deciphering. And deciphering what? All of this is occurring by way of the said. Whether you're talking about nonsense or sense or the absence from them all, we're dealing with the said. Whether you're talking about the known, the knowable, or the unknowable, we are dealing with what is said. It's by way of what's been said that we deal with conscious and unconscious knowledge alike. Lacan is nothing if not explicit about this in Seminar 20, and it's the opening that we've been waiting for. Now, before we jump right in to that opening, I don't want you to get me wrong. Don't hear me wrong here. Don't get me wrong. The law language of the unconscious puts us on the path of saying, of the embodied evental act and fact of speaking. It puts us on the path. But it's still fundamentally a matter of the said. The unconscious may put us on the path of the saying, but it is still fundamentally a matter of the said. Right? Right. Just as Lacan says on page 100, and as he reiterates in the passage we've considered here, the unconscious is only on the basis of what is said. Go back, check out that passage from page 100. Okay, I told you I was going to get serious, but like I said, I'm feeling light and whimsical here, so just there. My dears, just bear with me here. Let me say what I mean. No nomos, no homonomos. You see, there are lots of ways to make a homonym. And remember, I'm talking about Lalangue here. There are lots of ways to make the homonymic pop. But as near as I can tell, you can't do it without words, without what's been said. I'm giving you a clue as to what Lacan means when he says the unconscious, even at the level of Lalangue, is only on the basis of what is said. If Lalangue is the field of the homonym, allowing for polysemy and the like, what I'm telling you here is that when you look at homonyms, you see a lot of words in place in order to make these things work. You can have, for instance, multiple meanings from one lexical origin. Consider, for instance, the word head. You can also have loan words from other languages that allow for homonymic statements, like the word date. How about the evolution of terms through sound change, like the one you just heard me trot out for you, right? Right. And then there's the big daddy, so to speak. The coincidental convergence of signifiers, S1 in fact, ever in swarm formation that you see with words like bank. Head date, right bank. So bank right, date head, or at least date right, bank head. With these saids, I'm trying to show, come subjects as well. Thinking subjects of conscious knowledge, if you believe that bit of nonsense, and far more thoughtful subjects of the unconscious. Notice this. With the said comes the subject. If you start with the said language of conscious knowledge, you arrive at that thinking subject that so informed Descartes. If you start with the said la language of the unconscious, you arrive at Lacan's vaunted subject of the unconscious. But we are still dealing with subjects because we are still dealing with saids. And all, seds and subjects alike, once more inscribed in a certain dimension. Indeed, as Lacan points out, subject is among those words, right up there with individual and substance, which amount to facts of what is said. Now, you heard me trot that quote out earlier about individual and substance being words that amount to facts of what is said. This is him describing the language of being. Notice, in the very next sentence, on page 118, it's the subject. The subject is also among these words, like individual, like substance, that amounts to a fact of what is said. The subject, in this sense, is distinct from speaking. And this is that opening that we've been waiting for. Sayings lost in seds, speaking bodies lost in spoken beings, you heard me say. Foremost among these spoken beings behind which the speaking body is forgotten is not just the Cartesian subject, I'm telling you, but also the classic Lacanian subject of the unconscious. Whether we're talking about the conscious subject of philosophical lore or the subject of the Lacanian unconscious, we are still not yet talking about a speaking body in either case. Just as saying exists the said, the speaking body exists these sibling subjects, conscious and unconscious alike. Which is why I've told you that corporal knowledge is knowledge without a subject, but not without a body. Corporal knowledge is knowledge without a subject, but not without a body. You see, conscious and unconscious knowledge are modes of knowing in which bodies get lost behind subjects. Not so when it comes to corporal knowledge. Corporal knowledge is a mode of knowing in which subjects give way to bodies. In the sensory realm of corporal knowledge, I live not as subject, but as speaking, to quote Lacan at the end of Seminar 20. In the sensory realm of corporal knowledge, you live the same, not as subject, but as speaking. And again, note the sharp distinctions between this sense and that of consciousness. The said language of conscious knowledge is about making sense, by which I mean meaning. Signifieds over signifiers over bodies, you've heard me say, Encore, and here without a space between the N and the C. The sayings that constitute corporal knowledge are also about sense, but not en route to meaning. The sense at work in corporal knowledge and its embodied sayings is sensory experience, by which I mean feeling, éprouver, at the level of one's own body. Note, we are again dealing with an inversion of conscious knowledge. Bodies over signifiers over signifieds. Here we find encore with a space between the N and the C. In the said mansion of conscious and unconscious knowledge, we see nonsense beyond sense and absence beyond them both. I've told you. Beyond the known, the knowable, and beyond them both, the unknowable. But let me ask you, What, my friends, is beyond absence here? What's beyond the unknowable? What indeed could be beyond the vast, impregnable darkness of la language in all its unknowable, unconscious truth? Indeed, what could possibly exceed unknowable, unconscious truth? The real. In corporal knowledge and its attendant sayings, we encounter a form of lived experience that is not just true, but also, more precisely, real. Beyond unknowable, unconscious truth is the real to which every speaking body appeals. This is what Lacan means when he says the real is the mystery of the speaking body at the end of chapter 10. In the mystery of the speaking body, of the body whose acts of saying exist whatever's said as a result of this saying, we encounter the real. In the mystery of the speaking body, we indeed encounter the real. And this, in my view, at the very end of Seminar 20, is where things get tricky. So hang on and hang on tight. Note, for instance, the rest of the sentence that I just quoted for you. Here you have it. The real is the mystery of the speaking body. It is the mystery of the unconscious. It's on page 131 of our reading. Go ahead and check it out. Now note, I've translated it from the French a little differently than what Bruce gives you, but it's effectively giving us more or less the same sense, as it were. And it raises the same question for me. Why in God's name does Lacan add the mystery of the unconscious here, thereby equating it with the mystery of the speaking body? It's because he thinks that it's on the basis of unknowable, unconscious truth, with all its impregnable, indecipherable la language, that we can learn something about the speaking body, and by extension, the real to which it appeals. Here's how he puts it. It is on the basis of the cohabitation with Lalangue, it's on page 142, that a being known as speaking being is defined. When I look carefully at these sentences, I see two lessons that I'm eager to learn, almost as eager as I am to share them with you. Two lessons, both of which together, I think, allow us to further define, or at least delimit, the speaking body, in which knowledge without a subject, corporal knowledge, is instantiated. That speaking body in which knowledge without a subject is instantiated. That's what's at stake in these mysteries. And I got a title for each of these lessons, mainly to help me remember them, but maybe they'll help you remember them as well. A title for each of these two lessons that we stand to learn. Lesson 1, I would call it the saying behind the said. And lesson 2, the one or the other. It's to these lessons that we now turn.